Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the launch. Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, you need to put your headset.
Yes? Yes, you go live.
No, it is.
Oh. Okay. Now, can you hear me now, everyone? Excellent. So, good morning, and welcome to everyone to the launch of the Net Zero Policy Matters, the Interconnected Justice Reports, and we're also going to talk about your report, Catherine. This is a very special moment, and please forgive me for not following any of the normal protocols, because it's a very special moment for many of us, yes? Because last year, at the COP, we launched the Task Force on Net Zero Policy. Basically, what the purpose of the task force is to accelerate recommendation number 10. And many of you would say, well, what's recommendation number 10, yeah? Well, how many of you know this report, The Integrity Matters, yeah? Okay, the vast majority. So, Catherine, in a minute, you're going to have to explain everyone the history of Integrity Matters. But basically, Integrity Matters, it was the report that the HLEC, who was chaired by Catherine McKenna, handed over to the UN Secretary Generals, and it listed 10 recommendations that were like the benchmark against which we need to assess net zero pledges made by non-state actors. A little bit, it says, what the must-haves and the must-not haves, the red lines, when it comes to net zero pledges and transition plans. But the 10th recommendation of that report, which was accelerate the road to regulation, basically said, look guys, we only have very few years left. Now we're talking about 25 years left, and if during those 25 years we need to, on one hand, get all those net zero pledges to be of really high quality in order to translate into real action, and on the other hand, convince everyone else who has not committed to a net zero pledge to commit, and then to develop, a transition plan and a pledge of the quality we're asking, literally there's no time. So what we need is governments to really step up, to take responsibility and to create the right policy framework for that. And that's why we launched the task force last year. And today we're really happy to present you the first two reports of the task force. So in the next hour, we're going to disentangle, we're going to share with you all the findings of both of the reports, what they mean, and what is, the implications of that. But I wanted first to have a little bit of more of a high-level discussion with two of the most extraordinary women in this space, two women that I personally really appreciate, admire, and that have been mentors to me. So on one hand, I have Catherine McKenna, that needs a little presentation. She is the chair of the high-level expert group. And on the other hand, I have Andrea Mezamurillo, who is the co-chair, my partner in crime of the task force. Both of them share that they are former ministers of the environment, and on top of it, Andrea is the deputy director of the UN and helping me with this because with all that.
CD.
Yes, there you go. Yeah. So, with that, and before we start going with all the thank yous, because I have to warn everything at a certain moment, this is going to turn into an Oscar-style speech, Catherine, can you tell us first, a little bit of the history of Integrity Matters?
Well, first of all, I'm really excited to be here. When you said launch, the way you pronounced it, I thought it was lunch, so that's why I came. So that's a joke. Everyone's tired. I'm a little tired, actually, to be honest. Yeah, it was in 2022 that the UN Secretary General asked me to chair a high-level expert group on the most long name ever, but really net zero commitments of corporates, financial institutions, cities, and regions. And there was two reasons. One, he wanted to make sure that it was very clear about what the criteria were and standards were if you were going to say you're net zero. And by the way, over, I think, 90%, we probably get an exact number. I see Tom Hale here. 90% of the world global GDP is covered by a net zero target. But on the flip side, he also really wanted to deal with greenwashing because he was very worried about the impact of greenwashing. It makes everyone feel like we're doing a lot more, and it also misleads real people who want to see action. So we had an amazing expert group. Helena was the most enthusiastic member, as you can see. And it was a great group. It was diverse. It was half were from the Global South. We have a number of members here. I see Malango, who is here, but it also wasn't usual suspects. I mean, we had an environmentalist, we had a scientist, we had the former governor of the Bank of China, we had a CEO, we had a former leader. Like we had a whole range of folks, and we had to do a lot of work to figure out, okay, what are the criteria? We came up with 10, but really 9, and then Helena went with the 10th one, so I don't even have to talk about the regulation part. But this report was really, okay, what do you need to do and what can you not do? That's kind of the way we thought about it. So, of course, you need a long-term target, and that is the easy part. Putting up your hand and saying, I'm going to be net zero by 2050. As my son says to me, like, Mom, are you going to be alive in 2050? And I say, well, yes, that is the plan, but then I'm even doing the math. Like, how old am I in 2050? So it's actually about doing the work every single day and having interim targets. And of course, transition plans that are high integrity, that actually, set out what you're going to do. And the most important thing to do is to reduce your emissions, drive money from fossil fuels to clean, and then think about people at the bottom as well as nature. And so that's what you must do. What can you not do? Because I think that's also really important. Anyone here from Canada? The oil sands, the biggest greenwashers ever. So I always tell them that you got to actually do things. You can't just advertise you're doing things, but you cannot say that you're net zero and lobby against climate action. And we see that that's a real issue. Some people lobby directly against climate action, but they also do it through trade associations, and that's obviously a real problem. You can't simply buy credits as opposed to reducing all your emissions through your value chain or financed emissions. And so I think the report was a really useful roadmap. And then the Secretary, am I supposed to talk about the second part? So the Secretary General then asked me as chair of HLAG, like what a weird name. Only in climate do you have things called like HLAGs, but anyway, as chair, he asked me to come back and report on progress. So many of you were involved in this report. Jane, most of all, late last night, finishing up the report with me. You can see it now. It's called, let's see if I can get it right, Integrity Matters, the hard work is now. I kind of feel like I'm a competitive swimmer, so that's like I kind of go with that like theme, because also everyone likes feeling like they do hard work even if they don't, so it's trying to get people really motivated. But I think it's more important than ever. So we issued our report showing that there actually is progress, because there's obviously been some high-profile defections, but at the same time, Tom Hill, 23% of Fortune, the 2,000 largest companies in the world, 23% increase in those that are actually setting net zero targets. Cities and regions have really stepped up, especially the large ones. And at our event today, we had Jay Inslee, the governor of Washington State, and he said like 60% of governors governors representing 60% of the U.S. population are all in on climate, are regulating, moving ahead. I was with Yana Garcia. She's from California. She's the Secretary of Environmental Stuff, and she was talking about California's regulation, which actually captures a lot of folks who think maybe they aren't captured, because they actually are. The same with European regulation, capturing a huge number of large American corporates and financial institutions. And so I think it's important because, I am Canadian, and, we had an election in the U.S., and there can be this idea, oh, okay, well, it's all going to stop. We're not going to see the movement right now on climate, but you see a lot of this, and we saw this in Canada at the subnational level when we had a government that was not the government I was part of, but the previous government was doing, literally nothing. That you saw provinces step up, and in fact our largest reduction of emissions was when the province of Ontario phased out coal. So I think we will continue to see progress. The only challenge is we need more integrity in terms of the commitments. So once again, you can't just have a long-term target, you have to have a short-term target, and in particular, Secretary General has said 2025, key year. Of course, we need to see national climate plans, but we also need to see new, more ambitious, high integrity transition plans from non-state actors, because it's got to work together. We need to create an ambition loop. We obviously have tons of work to do to stay within 1.5 degrees warming, which is a stretch goal. So when people tell you, oh, I don't know if we can do 1.5, has anyone ever won the Olympics still doing the time they did, like I'm a swimmer again, like when they were 6? No, stretch goals are stretch goals. You have to have stretch goals that are hard, but we can still do it, but we need to accelerate this action. So this ambition loop is really important. Obviously, NDCs are important to set the stage for corporates and financial institutions and cities and regions to know the direction of travel, to have the certainty they need to make the investments. And so that really is the update on the report. And then I was very happy that Helena took over recommendation 10 with great vigor and discipline, because of course ultimately you need to regulate for competitiveness reasons, to provide certainty, also to have actually consequences if you don't live up to your commitments.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for that great introduction and overview.
I probably did not do. Did I go into too much detail?
No, it is. Absolutely perfect, yeah? This is really informal, if you haven't realized yet, yeah? But moving to the net zero policy matters, yeah? And what you were talking, Catherine, about, that actually things are happening, more things are happening that we actually think. And probably one of the key outcomes of the report is precisely that one, that policy action, is happening much more widely around the world than we expected. And that actually action is not confined to developed countries, or shall I say to the EU, yes, because always been sort of qualified as the regulatory region or machinery, but it is also emerging markets who are helping to lead the way on regulation as well. And in fact, when you look at all the G20 countries, you find some sort of policies on all of them that help transition non-state actors to net zero. In fact, the number of policies have tripled since the 2020. So I would say that's probably the number one, conclusions of the report. And then we can, during the next hour, we're going to start, sharing with you all the rest of the findings. But one of the findings, probably, not so positive or halfway through, it's about, nature, adaptation and just transition. We really identified that there has been quite a lot of progress in the sense that awareness and action has grown, particularly, especially in some of the emerging markets, right? South Africa, Brazil, and yet we can really say that those three, so nature, adaptation, and just transition, no matter how important they are, and interlinked and interconnected to climate mitigation, they're yet not fully integrated or not systematically integrated. Andrea, you have extensive experience on not only as a Minister of Environment, but also in your current role. What does it mean, that finding? For you, you just came back from also COP16, the biodiversity COP. What does it mean, the finding of the task force?
Thank you, Helena, and I'm thrilled to be with this powerful women and building on this idea that we need to accelerate action. And we're seeing good things, but that are not enough. It's clear that these net zero policies needs to also be very systemic. And I think that this is one of the elements, right? Because we're living in this intertwined crisis. And we cannot resolve climate crisis today, biodiversity crisis tomorrow, and land degradation and inequality the next day. We need to resolve everything right now. And this is the call, and this is where we are seeing some weaknesses in this process. We need more transition plans. We need more clear targets that also address everything in this comprehensive matter. And I think that there are some initial findings in some of the countries. And as you were saying, we also need to understand that for developing countries and for these emerging economies, it's also to understand the right for this sustainable and inclusive development. So it's also this other aspect that we need to come and bring to the analysis. So when we're talking about these policies, when we're talking about engaging non-state actors, these financial institutions, these big corporates, they also need to be ambitious, address this in a systemic manner, and there is appetite for this. And there are some companies that are doing this, and on some financial institutions, there's always the how, and we still need to come with clear guidelines on the how. But as you were saying, it's really to generate the conditions as governments, when you are in the government, these enabling environments, to do it in this comprehensive manner, to do it in a way that we avoid the greenwashing, as we were hearing. Because there is a lot of good things happening, but a lot of not good things happening. And especially in this interconnected area where we're talking about carbon markets. And we're hearing a lot, right? And I know that there is a lot of not good examples, but carbon markets are very important. What we need is to guarantee this integrity. And there is options to develop this robust, high integrity carbon markets. And this requires regulation and policies. And I think that when we see this as a comprehensive ecosystem, and we are seeing this as part of the report, is that, yes, we still need to understand what are the good examples, the good policies that we need to put in place to accelerate, to generate this enabling environment for this good action with integrity and understanding as well. And I think that for a lot of for the emerging economies, that nature cannot be the cheap solution. Nature, it's critical, it's central. We will not achieve our climate goals without including nature and land management. And this is what we are seeing. And this is also the demand in many of the countries. And also for those countries that are dependent on fossil fuels, it's about what is the right approach for diversifying their economies. And it's also a conversation as well. So when the companies are doing their efforts, when their companies are starting their operations in these emerging markets, it's about not only adopting the do no harm approach, but it's also the do more good approach. And I think that this was the other interesting finding of our report.
Andrea, can I ask a follow-up question on, you are in 2 weeks going to what you call your COP, and maybe you can explain the audience what you mean by your COP, yeah? We had COP16 on biodiversity, the same way that we're saying, well, nature adaptation and just transition are not being yet systematically integrated when it comes to policies targeting non-state actors. Are they being, I mean, what is the interlinked, you know, and to what extent are connected the negotiations with the, you know, in terms of climate, biodiversity, yes, and land?
Thank you, Helena, for this. Yes. So we have the Rio Conventions, right? There are 3: biodiversity, land, and it was land degradation, the Convention to Combat Desertification, and climate. And what we are seeing first is the need to integrate more. We need synergies, because at the end, when you are a company, or even when you are a country, this idea of having different plans to address the different commitments that you have, it's crazy. When you are a small country with a very reduced number of experts and institutional capacities as well, to be producing several plans, it's crazy. And at the end, you have just one territory, one country. And you need to align the different commitments with your development needs, and this is when the magic happens. And my COP, as you were saying, is the one that deals with land degradation. So it's about scaling up land restoration as the solution and drought resilience. And in 2 weeks, we will be there in Saudi Arabia. It will be the first time that the kingdom is hosting a COP. And very committed in scaling up these efforts on land restoration and on drought resilience. So I think that at the end, we're seeing the need in the three conventions in this negotiation. There are some elements that are cross-cutting. Nature is one, transforming food systems is the other one, and it's very related to the way that we manage our land, our landscape, and the solutions to guarantee food security, water security, and at the same time reduce emissions. And it's possible. There are technologies, the solutions are there. We need good policies for this. We need to scale up those solutions. And we see this need there, but coming again, I think that we're also hearing, of course, the need to mobilize resources to the communities that are owning these resources, that are doing and implementing these strategies, solutions, small businesses. This is the challenge there, how to mobilize resources in the scale and at the pace that it is needed. And I think that this conversation is also the one, in one way or the other, when we're talking about this just transition. But on these three aspects, again, having a good enabling environment, aligning, right, I think the conversation on harmful subsidies, right, and repurposing them with incentives. I think that it's cleared a lot of the solutions, and by saying clear, I'm not saying it's easy. They're very difficult, and this is when we need courage, when we need good leadership, and when we need to support each other. This requires a lot of collaboration, especially in the current context, but it is possible, and we need to stick to that vision, because it's not only about having all these plans, it's to have good plans, aligned with the 1.5, with this, addressing these systemic issues, mobilizing the resources where they are required, and well, to start the action now.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for that. And if you allow me to move from the very macro you were talking about to something much more concrete when it comes to, for example, financial regulation, that's one of the main reasons why you said why it's so important to include, for example, the do no significant harm in terms of the interconnection of the different environmental objectives when you're developing a taxonomy. That's why it's so important that transition plans do not stick to mitigation, that they include adaptation, just transition, and also the environmental objectives, particularly if they are material from a double materiality perspective to the company and the environment. But before, unfortunately, all great conversations that must come to an end. So I want to end with you, Catherine, and from all your extensive experience, tell us what a report like the one we're launching today, what does it mean for the current negotiations and for the current global political environment?
Do you mean your report or my report or
both reports? You can talk about both.
Just got to make sure I know what I'm talking
reports,
about
but
here.
Because our report is more the part. Let's focus on policy and regulation. Yeah.
Well, I mean, look, I think we can see a lot of leadership out there, and I think it's really important because these leaders have shown that it is just good business sense to actually act on net zero. It manages your risk. It also helps identify opportunities. It's also the right thing to do. But the reality is we're not going to get everyone there in that way, particularly the current context. So I think regulation is really important. And as I pointed out, I mean, the regulation, like if you look at what's happening in Europe, it catches a lot of folks that aren't just European companies. And I think that's also really important. And it's going to be messy. Like, look, I was in politics. Like, people are like, well, it would be easier. I was like, yeah, there's lots of things that would be easier. You don't get to, governments will break your heart. But some will be more ambitious. And I think that's what we're all just going to keep on keeping on. And as I said, you saw Jay Inslee, for those of you who may have watched our event earlier today, I mean, he was like, we're all in. We're moving forward. 60% of the U.S. population that we cover, we're regulating. And so I think that's just really important. And also, I think when you do regulation, and we heard this from business, and I think it is also important that we look at streamlining regulation. I mean, we need to do it. It's hard to figure it out. So sometimes you're going to go do things. As I told folks, when I was minister, I mean, we did our best. And then carbon pricing, we had to adjust a bit. That's life, but you do it. Then, you get some feedback. And I think alignment is really important so that we can actually have corporates say it's not a big deal. I'm doing it here, so it's, something that we need to do. And look, I think we all will continue moving forward. And why? It was actually John Podesta. I don't know if people are listening to John Podesta. I mean, the science on climate is not changing. We have an accelerating climate crisis, but at the same time, we have an accelerating clean energy revolution. So those are the facts. And the world is changing very quickly, and I didn't give enough of a shout out to Asia, because we've seen in the net zero trends that there's a lot of action happening in Asia and other regions. So look, I think it's not going to be linear. But we don't have time to waste, so we're all going to have to really dig deep, and that's going to be cities and regions. It's going to be non-state actors more broadly, corporates and financial institutions, and then it's going to be people. Because I think that's what's missing a bit in this conversation, that we keep on hearing about entrenched interest, like really entrenched interest, saying, oh no, this transition is really bad. We really have to fight that. We have the IEA projections. Other people are coming out with other projections that are fake, that we need to be working actually on the projections. We need to be thinking about, as I say to Canadians, like, do you want stranded assets? Because those are yours. Those are liabilities that you are going to have. And it means we're wasting money that we could be investing in the clean transition. So I think that having people, like, so if you are not a non-state actor here, you're not a regulator, you can still be part of this, because I think we need to be demanding action. And that's why transparency is really important on this. Because most people, if you ask them, they want action on climate. If we can actually show who's actually leading so they can get rewarded, and those that aren't acting can get penalized based on just facts, I think that's going to make a real difference in places where the regulation isn't really there. But it's all going to, we're keeping on, we're all keeping on, keeping on.
Thank you so much, Catherine. If I may add just one thing, I think that right now we need to add a second fight, I think, to our fight on climate change, against climate change, against biodiversity loss, land desertification and so forth, which is the fight against misinformation. Because I think that, and I really hope that our reports help to fight that misinformation that is spreading around the world. Yeah, we need green policies. We need policies that help and support non-state actors to transition to net zero by 2050. And sometimes we feel that we're losing the narrative despite all the proof and the impact that those policies are having. So that would be my message to all of you today. And please join me in thanking Catherine and Andrea. This is not over yet.
And like, you know what? I don't know if she's going to get the applause, but Helena is really awesome. We all wouldn't be here at this event without Helena. And I will say, taking on recommendation 10 and running with it was pretty amazing.
Thank you, Catherine. And today I was warning you that it's a little bit like a Oscars type of event, this one. And to add to that, I really want to thank somebody very special with whom I've worked for many years, and sometimes I think that I had a secret agenda setting up the task force and asking the PRI to host it, and that is, because of Nathan, Fabian and I had worked together in the EU context. It's absolutely magnificent to work with you, it's so enriching, as it is with Catherine and Andrea, and I know that this report will not be of the quality that it is without you and the entire PRI Secretariat. So thank you so much. And we will continue the thank yous, but I want to leave the stage to Nathan.
Is that one on? Yes. You have a short interlude. I'm not going to dance or anything, don't worry. So I think we'll get our next panelists up. Are you happy to sit for a few minutes while I give some overview of the key points of the report? So please come and sit, colleagues. Are you willing? Come on. It's more fun if we're doing it together. Oh, hi, Sarah. Okay, so now that Helena has said what a wonderful job has been done with the report, we should probably tell you a bit more about what's in it. And I'm going to do that in a moment. But before we do, as we're all sitting up here together, this is Sarah Jane Ahmed from the V20. This is Irene Hemskirk from NGFS. This is Malango Mugogo from Zeni Zeni. And we have Igor Panovic from UNCTAD. Now, these colleagues were involved either in the board of trustees that oversaw the project or the technical group that did the work. And we managed to put together a board of 8 organizations and 25 technical experts that worked pretty well together globally over about a 7-month period. And that is a minor miracle in itself. So we thank everyone for the work that they did together. So I'll just tell you a few things that are in the report. And it's so rich that this will be little more than a signposting exercise. But if you do find 20 minutes over the next couple of weeks, it's worth it. So what did we do? We looked at G20 countries for their net zero policies, and we considered emerging and vulnerable economy interconnected justice issues. And so there are actually 2 reports in there, and it's important to look at both. The data sources we used, and our partners on this project are so important. Net Zero Policy and Regulation Hub from the University of Oxford. We used a large language model managed by Canberra that examined the climate change laws of the world, the ONZ 2023 database, the PRI regulation database, and the IEA policies database. And so we used a large language model to distinguish what's inside the policies, not just what existed, but what's the level of quality, what's the level of ambition. And I'll tell you a bit more about that in a minute, because that's kind of the interesting thing about this work. Now, more information than what you can probably absorb, but there's a table in the report that says exactly which policies were in this universe. And that's important because we didn't try to look at everything. So corporate and financial policy instruments and regulations like entity-level sustainability disclosure obligations, prudential obligations, investment product disclosures, accounting standards, taxonomies, stewardship codes, due diligence obligations, corporate and investor duties. These are the corporate and financial instruments. And then on the real economy side, it could have been a very, very long list of policies. So we limited ourselves to what the H-leg called out specifically and looked at the interaction of those real economy policies with all those corporate and financial policies. So where those things actually either help or hinder or add some substance. And that included things like net zero laws and frameworks, energy transition instruments, fossil fuel and renewable energy renewable energy roadmaps, subsidies, incentive schemes, and fossil fuels on the licensing and planning side, and policies around land use, deforestation and peatland, where these flow into carbon market mechanisms. So it's a select set of policies, but it yielded 1,000 policies for us to consider across the G20. So it's a very, very rich data set that we were able to put together. And as I say, the interesting things were the quality attributes. Looking at the objectives of each policy, the ambition levels relative to 1.5, the connections to other sustainability objectives like just transition, like land use, like nature and biodiversity, looking at coverage and levels of accountability, and then relationships to the wider regulatory framework. So really we were interested, how well is this framework operating together? We don't claim this is going to solve the whole problem of net zero transition, but it's an important piece of the overall policy suite. And so how well is the network and web of policies working together? That's what we really tried to discern. So just a few data points and then we'll start our discussion. So disclosure is the most common policy reform area across the G20. No surprises there. And the ISSB is obviously helping. So 6 jurisdictions globally, 3 of them G20 have now adopted, and many more regions planning to adopt. On taxonomies, this has been more of a success story than I think people have realized. 50 taxonomies globally, 14 of the G20 now have something adopted or in development. That's very substantial, and the interoperability of those is going to be a key question. Transition plans, this is super interesting. 8 of G20 in total have some transition plan obligations already. The 3 EU countries have mandatory, but there are 5 with voluntary, and we know there's going to be many, many more. So this is a key area of reform. But there's even more interesting things going on transition. You can find transition elements in lots of aspects of economic policy, sectoral policy, procurement policies. In South Africa, there's a requirement or a power for ministers to allocate South Africa's carbon budget to different sectors. That sure gives a kick to transition planning, doesn't it? So there's so much happening on transition globally that is going to really motivate this transition piece. But overall, we know the action is not enough. And just a couple of quick facts. We have looked at coverage, enforcement, interoperability, depth of policy. We've looked at transparency of accounting mechanisms. We've looked at third-party verification. We've looked at assurance levels. So if you want to understand what's really going on these policies, you have that data available to you. On the 1.5 ambition point, I said we had 1,000 policies. Only around about a quarter of them are corporate and financial, of that 1,000. 2/3 identify a link to a national climate goal. Almost a third identify a link to the Paris agreements, but only 20 identify a link to 1.5. So that's a very small percentage. On the economic side, the numbers are the same. So 700 odd policies that are economic related out of our data set, only 57 of them identify an explicit link to 1.5. So we're not quite getting the follow through on 1.5 in this policy framework. It's quite important. All right. The risk is that I tell you more of the 10,000 interesting things in this report and we don't hear from our panel. So why don't I stop there? We're going to cover the just transition elements on this discussion. It's one of the more, I think, substantial contributions to the how we move forward globally question in this piece of work. And so the discussion on just transition and how we take it up is going to be very important. All right. But I really recommend it to you. It's interesting work, and I think that with the research partners like Oxford, especially, we've really established a field of analysis here, which is going to advance this policy area. So let's start with Irene, please. Open question to start. What's your reaction to the positive policy progress and the gap that remains?
Thanks so much, Nathan. Great to be here. And I think being in the pavilion of Spain, I cannot start without first expressing my sympathy and support to the people in Spain of the horrible events that happened in Valencia. And again, that is the stark reminder of why we're talking about this topic today and why we need to progress. So moving from that part to congratulating you and the chairs on this really, really excellent report, I think is the most comprehensive analysis I have seen on policies worldwide and really providing the insights of what's happening around the globe. If you would have this report 10 years ago, I think it shows we would be searching for some examples, right? If we would have done it 5 years ago, maybe we should have some light in the darkness. But where we are now, I think it's brightening up. So I think that's really the positive sign I get from it on the disclosure side, on also the 8 out of 20 with some transition plans. It's good, but let's keep it going. Let's keep it going because that's really what we need. And I was happily involved from the NGFS side. So this is this network for greening the financial system. Over 140 central banks around the globe are united there in that voluntary network, working together. And we did some work on the prudential side and the risk side of things. And I'm very happy that that part is reflected also in the report, right? Because if you're talking about reliability, this is something we really need from the financial sector to really have the investments flowing, avoiding greenwashing, all these elements that you need to know. And I think transition plans is really a key product of that. So to keep it short, Maya is okay. We've made great progress, and thanks so much for providing the arguments and the details and the work behind that. Let's keep it going. Horizontally, more countries progressing, and also more vertically improving the legislation we have and the policies we have. Thanks.
Why don't we keep going with you? Because you raised the question of transition plans. So let's go on to that second question and then we can see where it goes. We've got new modelling from NGFS, new scenarios, which Sabina mentioned the GDP loss numbers of 15% potentially, I think. This is interesting. This gives a whole new perspective on transition planning in a way, these more concerning scenarios. So what should we be expecting of our transition plans from our non-state actors, especially when the policy settings can sometimes be a bit challenging?
Yeah, so indeed the new versions of the NGFS climate scenarios were published, I think, last week, and we incorporated a damage function, and that really, really amplified the expected losses that could happen if we don't address climate change. So that's, I think, a very important conclusion of that. And still, right, it doesn't include tipping points yet. So we've really and some other really key aspects, because we just cannot grasp it. We've been working together with climate scientists a lot. What is the right climate scenario? This is where we are now. And it's already frightening, I would say, the impact it could have. And then we'll be progressing and improving going forward on the NGFS climate scenarios to also incorporate other aspects and to really grasp the impact that we're having. Because I see a lot of people wearing 1.5 pins. I wish I had one as well, and I wish we could reach it. Because that's not the trajectory we're on, right? It doesn't come to a surprise in the people attending COP, but we're still almost more on a 3-degree scenario. So what is it that we're preparing for? And we still need to transition. But maybe quickly on, because it was touched on the introductory panel with the magnificent ladies. What is the policy environment? Is it helping us or is it damaging us? I think, I hope, and I expect it will be pretty immune. Because there is a market demand, right? There is a business case to make your house more energy efficient because you pay less electricity. So there will be transition going forward. There will be more on a local level as well. There is a market demand also for reliability. So there will be also a push for more reliable policy pathways and also more reliable policy trajectories. So I really hope that this will keep going. I also very much agree on the point that we shouldn't talk about climate alone. Nature is really the big next thing, adaptation, and also the just part, how can we make sure that this part is being uplifted? Because I think we also, climate, we're progressing, but on the other areas, we really need to step up as well. And doesn't make our lives easier, but it's something we really need to do.
Thanks, Irene. And thank you to NGFS for the incredible work that you're doing. Okay, so let's think about impacts and some of the connections, and we'll bring in Sarah. So the question's a simple one. What will the report findings mean for climate vulnerable countries? And of course, Sarah's from the V20. And so the level of insight about the impact here is really important. So please, share your thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, it was useful to see the movement of non-state actors in G20 countries. Gives a little bit of hope. But as you know, we're totally off track. I think for the V20 countries, we can't have macroeconomic stability without climate stability and ecological stability. And the findings also mean that we ourselves need to transition our economies just so that, one, we can be competitive, but two, because we have a lot of renewable energy wealth actually sitting in our economies. We're unable to unlock it because of cost of capital issues, debt instability, which means here at the COP, for us to be able to participate in this transition in a just manner, we will need that core public sector commitments so that we can also mobilize our domestic private sector, which it does exist in our countries. They can participate, but to get them in, we need incentives and the right cost of capital to make this all happen. And again, the V20 wants to be part of the solution, but to do that, we need to address some of the fiscal constraints that we have.
Okay, so fiscal constraints we won't dive directly into, as important as it is, and it's an important question. But there are other impacts from these policies, these net zero policies, and this is what we tried to pick up with this question of interconnected justice. And this takes us to the second question. So what do you think the potential impacts are on some of the interconnected justice issues, and what did you like or think was valuable from the second piece of work?
So important to note that the most vulnerable communities, besides the getting impacted by the worst of climate change, also get impacted when we attempt to transition. Because it's their land, they're sitting perhaps on a lot of this wealth, and they're not part of the business model, they're not included in the decisions. Decisions are made here, they're kind of told, and we can't operate like that anymore. We're at a point where we need to ensure that support here goes to the local level, and to do that, we need stronger national institutions so that they could better support local communities. The other thing is a lot of this is capital intensive, and it's really important that we don't end up in a situation where we're so unstable on the debt side because of this capital intensiveness that we can't pay for health, education, or other infrastructure needs. So it's a tough situation fiscally, but also at the community level. And to do this, I think we count actors to participate and come in and partner in our country.
Maybe use this one in case. Is everyone hearing? No, okay. I'm going to swap mics with you. Can we just follow up on that? So you mentioned the fiscal point again, and the question of the role of non-state actors versus public finance is obviously a central issue at this COP. So you said there was a role for private actors, and I guess we've understood this in terms of supply chains and due diligence obligations, and the question that we identify in the report is how do you do good, not only do no significant harm, and that's part of the role. Is there something else that non-state actors should be doing on the fiscal side?
I think one is a lot of the, just as in the G20, the non-state actors are working there. It's similar as well in the V20 countries. We could have non-state actors participate too, just because government balance sheets are stretched thin. And so there is opportunities there. The second is enabling participation at the local and indigenous community level and protecting them, protecting their rights. So this goes to land rights, which is why it's really hard to separate, again, climate, nature, and development. It's all linked. And so having the separation as well with finance and policy is really challenging, and I think we have to move past that. And so yeah, the report was very helpful, I think, in highlighting the interconnectedness of these issues.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And I think at least the groups involved in this process are very keen to explore and expand. We know how critical they are to achieving lasting change. Okay, Igor. So you sit. Okay, so we'll now go on to Igor, who from UNCTAD's position has a wonderful institutional global view. So two things for you, Igor. Do we think NSA policy can enhance justice in some way? That's the first thing. And then the second thing is, what's the role of international institutions in stewarding just transition through this policy lens? So please share your experience.
Thank you very much for this question. Yes, I think there is a big role for policies which would actually guide non-state actors to do much more good and not just to avoid doing significant harm. And I think that should be actually the guiding principle for all our policies regarding non-state actors. Why am I saying that? I think the progress report that we just launched today is actually showing that the voluntary approaches, voluntary schemes have in the last 5-6 years shown that they are not enough given the urgency that we have to address climate impact. So there is now an increase in the number of policy instruments and policies all over the world, not just in G20 countries, and it's clearly coming out of the report. But this also shows that the governments are now conscious of the policy void that we have, and they are now trying to catch up, so to speak. And this is, for me, probably the most encouraging sign that we have. So I think we are moving towards an idea where the governments would actually be much more involved and would have a kind of market shaping policies more than just being neutral and leaving to the market what happens. And I think that's exactly in which direction policies should go if we want to have a justice. And the second part of the question, what international institutions can do, of course, they can, first of all, promote this idea that the private sector has to be nudged in the right direction, that on their own, private sector markets will solve the issue maybe in the 40, 50, 60 years, but that's not good enough for us. Because by then we will be on track to 3 or more degrees. So if we want to bend the curve, and I think we all agree here that we have to bend the curve in the next 10 years, otherwise we are doomed, we have to have much more market-shaping policies. And international institutions at all levels, the UN included, should play a big role in that. And also, for that we need, as a next step, international standards. We need to put out the best practices and try to adopt them as wide as possible.
Okay, so this sounds like an trajectory, obligations and clarifying and integrating and aligning. So there's no turning back for Igor on this path. It's probably the case for everyone in this room. That we don't think we're turning back, and I guess this is one of the interesting things about this report, despite US hesitancy over their own future, the rest of the G20 is reforming and getting on with it, and that's a wonderful sign, and we can all work on that together while they're a bit unsure, and of course with the US states as well who are willing. So thank you, Igor, and for the role you and UNCTAD have played over the years. Okay, Malengo, thanks for your patience, but in a way, you get to give maybe one of the most interesting stories, because South Africa comes out as a real reforming country on non-state actor policy. And so from your perspective, what are some of the highlights of the policy approach? And of course, we all know there's incredible insight on social justice and on social development. So please, share your views.
Thanks. Yeah, it's great to be here. I just want to say, in terms of turning back time, that photo of me was taken maybe like 10 years ago or something, like no gray hair. So if there's any way to make it real, that would be great. But yes, so Zeni Sustainable Finance is based in South Africa, although we operate at an international level and believe we bring an African perspective, African voice to this. And South Africa is, I'd say, perhaps unique in the sense that it's the only African G20 country for many years. Like the AU has joined, but as an individual country, it's just South Africa. And most of our energy is based on coal. So we also have a very interesting history, which I'm sure you're well aware of. From a human rights perspective, I would say that we're, to some extent, ahead of the game, or have been ahead of the game, because it's an issue that is integral to the society and has been for a long time. And so because of the coal being sort of first in line in terms of having to come off fossil fuels, there have been lots of interventions in the voluntary space, both from companies and from financial institutions for a long time, but particularly from a government perspective. And it's also because being a developing country, we do rely on, about 40% of our coal is exported. So we're dependent on what happens in other parts of the world. So if there's an announcement by a big coal importing country that things are going to change, South Africa does need to react and respond. So it's a combination of what needs to be done locally and internationally. And that's where some of the justice issues come into play. So we're very well aware of the justice issues in terms of shutting down coal mines, transforming electricity generation, which at the moment is based on sort of big generating schemes run by largely one company with a few independent producers. How do you shift an entire energy system to be low carbon and resilient? Adaptation is very important, while addressing issues related to jobs. while addressing issues related to the whole value chain that the fossil fuel industry has successfully built over many, many years. And in the context of democracy, I think that's also really important. Some of the challenges, governments have 5-year terms. Politicians, Catherine has left, but maybe there's some other politicians in the room. Policies have to get through election cycles as well, and that's another reality. So those are some of the sort of forces that have driven what's happened. But as you say, I know I'll get to the actual results of the report. So what has happened on a very voluntary basis, a lot of companies have done things. But on the regulatory side, there's been actually quite a big push, interestingly, from the financial sector. And in particular, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, which for historical reasons, there's something called the King Code of Governance, which has affected governance across the world globally for several decades. But they're essentially, we call them a secondary regulator, right? Because if a stock exchange says, look, if you want to list here, you have to do X, Y, Z, it becomes regulation, even though they're not an official regulator. So they, 2 years ago, developed climate and sustainability guidance, just guidance, in relation to things like transition plans. And that's already begun to shift the market a little bit. And then similarly, our Reserve Bank, which regulates both insurers and banks, and then does all the other stuff that Reserve Banks do, like monetary policy, issued again guidance for related to climate, risk management and disclosure, which I think is the process that a lot of NGFS countries, I'm saying, have gone through sort of a similar process. But what's important is that it's guidance, and they've said that it's because they're not ready. They want the market to move slowly in a certain direction. They don't want to bring in regulation that is ineffective, which doesn't really help anyone. So it's positive, going in the right direction, but we need to see the regulation coming as quickly as possible, and it needs to go outside the financial sector as well.
Go ahead. Thank you, Malengo. Would you like to add, Irene, please?
Thanks for raising the point on voluntary market development and regulation, I think, Malengo, because that's the point. Because I think we have enough that we can agree on as a kind of a baseline. This is what we all think, and that will hopefully also guide a bit more convergence around the globe, because that's the other big need. But we need to have find this sweet spot of what can we leave to develop and trial and error a little bit with market initiatives that can build upon it, but to at least see where we can, on a regulatory side, agree on the building blocks, on the baseline of everything that we do on this point, and see how can we take and try out in the few years to come a bit more what works, what doesn't. For metrics and targets, it's really complicated, right? How do you really measure for a certain sector? You need sectoral pathways, so maybe you need a little bit more of time of that. So I like the example you shared for the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. This is exactly what it is. And then when it's developed, when it's matured, it can be shipped over and more cemented in regulation.
Yes, thank you, Irene. So that's one call for the future, if you like, or what we need to focus on next. Malengo, did you have another point? What do you think we can be doing next with this effort that we've all got moving this year?
How much time do we have?
You've got 1 minute.
Yeah, I had quite a long list. I mean, I think one of the key things is that I mentioned interconnected justice. So what happens in one country affecting another? And I think that's incredibly important, even for value chains where they're SMEs. Countries need to take this into account. And there can be unintended consequences, so please, we need to think about these upfront to avoid those and not push people into further vulnerability. And then the other side is that just to remember that it's about a massive transformation. I use the words great, just transformation to resilience. Because ultimately, yes, we're talking about reducing emissions here and net zero, but ultimately it's about becoming more resilient as a whole, as societies and economies. And I think we just need to sort of have that North Star much more clearly laid out for the regulators and the policymakers in particular. And I'd say the last area is to spread the word, and somehow, even though we haven't necessarily done it that well, but somehow empower and really bring the vulnerable to the table. They have many of the solutions. They are part of the solution. They are delivering on some of the solutions, and I really think we need to figure that one out because otherwise we'll never hit that North Star.
Thank you, Malengo. So this part of the work just demonstrates how serious we are about implementing this policy well. So thinking about how it's going to be implemented in practice and supported and make a positive difference to people's lives. So these are lasting reforms. So thank you for that. All right, we've given you a lot in an hour. For bearing with us, and I think Helena's going to close us out. Thank you, panelists, and well done.
Now you can hear me well. There you go, yeah? So thank you everyone for joining us today in our launch, right? In the launch of our two reports, the Net Zero Policy Matters and Interconnected Justice. I wanted to finish by looking a little bit what can you expect from the task force moving ahead, yeah? So we identified 4 key areas of work that we would like to delve into, that we would like to take forward. The first one, Malengo just pointed out to it, the interconnected justice. So I won't go into it because we're very short of time, but so taking forward interconnected justice, number 1. Number 2, transition planning and transition plans. So on one hand, we see as definitely one of the key asks moving forward is the transition plans for the largest companies in the world should be mandatory. But also we need to start looking at the specific elements with those transition plans. This is about, where is the teeth in those transition plans and the core elements. Things like the financial planning, the CapEx expenditures, the CapEx plans, but also on how do you translate avoiding carbon lock-in in a transition plan, yeah? How do you translate that in your financial reporting or sustainability reporting? Number 2, adaptation. One of the things we haven't done is to look at policies only exclusively looking at adaptation. We think that it is a must that we need to look, and adaptation not in isolation, but adaptation with, that interconnectedness that Andrea was pointing out at the very beginning of our event on nature and just transition, yeah? And mitigation, how can we really get, that sort of package that we need and start looking at financing adaptation, yeah? It is critical to really scale up financing on adaptation, not least mobilize private capital for financing adaptation. And the third point, I think that it draws from one of the key conclusions of the report, which is that when you look at the policies and when you will read the report, because you're all going to read the report, you're going to see the variety and diversity of policies, yeah, that are being, developed and implemented across the world. So there's a great space and a great opportunity for learning, for collaboration, for sharing. So we really hope, the task force to start creating those spaces for that learning and sharing, and collaboration, and not least to really start promoting compatibility, interoperability, because if we really want to create a policy framework that really works for the largest companies in the world and financial institutions, we need, one coherent and consistent policy framework. With that, just very quickly, last minute, I cannot go without thanking, I already thank my partner in crime, Catherine, the board, but I really want to mention, thank you so much to the V20, UNCTAD, UNEP-FI, OECD, HLEC, and NGFS for all the support that you've given us, to the PRI. I cannot express it enough. David, thank you for onboarding on this without really knowing, what was going to come out of it. I also want to really thank our knowledge partners, the Net Zero Regulation and Policy Hub that were here with us today. Thank you so much. Amazing work. The Gratham Institute on Climate Change and Environment of the London School of Economics and Canterbury Insight. And last but not least, a huge thank you to every single member of the technical expert group of the task force and every single member of the team of PRI and the Secretariat. And I'm looking at Gina, who's here today with us. So thank you everyone for listening to us today. And do read the report and spread the word. Thank you.